using that grid as our starting point, we are now going to find some textures through the best source we have. And keeping in mind this is an educational project working on now, we're going to go to the free source, which is Google. If you were doing this in the real way, we would use other sources such as iStock, photography, or take your own shots, but we're using Google. I'm just putting in concrete, and then I'm going to search for images, keeping it nice and simple. Kind of expand this to see what we're talking about here. With the images mode already selected, you can see automatically a whole bunch of default things come up, and that's exactly what we're looking for. There's always pros and cons to every texture that we choose. Going down this list, you'll see that under the current build of Google, that if you hover over any images, they give you the pixel dimensions in the lower black bar that appears over each one of these. I'm going to modify my search under any size here to go down to large, and that's kind of under what Google considers to be quote-unquote large, which here is someplace in the 2000 by 1500 category. We're basically looking for the largest we can find. If I go all the way down to 70 megapixels, which is obviously quite huge, you're not going to find an awful lot, or I should say the stuff you do find is going to be very, very specific to things unlike, I'm sure, what you're trying to find. We're looking for just a classic texture. Let's go to maybe a more reputable 10 megapixels. Nothing too horrible here. There's some good stuff. This one, for example, 3800 by 2500 roughly, and it's a neat piece. Let's take a quick click on it, see what we get. Nothing too bad. I'm going to look at the view original image real quick to see what we're dealing with. I should note, of course, that any image we find on Google is subject to copyright, so I'm not trying to get around that, but you should be aware that it is a major concern. We would not want to grab things from Google for images you're going to use for actual advertising or print projects. It is a copyright concern. So for considering this is just for educational purposes, I'm going to grab this one, drag this one in, and then see kind of how it behaves in this environment. So sometimes when I click out of Photoshop and come back into it, I actually have to kind of reset things. So again, here is where I would normally go for something that is production quality, something that I'm actually going to use in an advertisement. And even within this realm, there will be certain rights and restrictions that I need to really make sure I'm paying attention to when I purchase an image. iStock Photography, or iStockPhoto.com, is a pretty good source. It's pretty run-of-the-mill, average quality, nothing too highbrow, nothing too low. It's kind of a right-in-the-middle area. If I click on the first one that pops up here, which is this image here, concrete wall, let's see if I click on this guy. Here are my general prices. Now they do things in terms of credits, and it's roughly $1.10 or $1.25 per credit. So this is someplace in the vicinity of $30, $35 for the largest image. Every image is going to have its own qualities and its own size availabilities. But as you can see, as I scan through this one's pretty decent. It's got some nice texture to it. I am not going to actually buy anything for this project. It's just for review, so I'll avoid this and go back to where I was from the Google search, keeping in mind that since we're talking about it, this is not copyright free. This image, as simple as it may be, does have a copyright attached to it, so we're not using this for anything printed or production quality. Alright, so let's see here. Just trying to get back into my groove. Okay, so the move tool is selected, and I'm going to pull this back into place, kind of reposition it in my layers here. Now, as I always say, in the grid, we're going to use the transformation tools, the transform tool modifier, to adjust this and get it to fit into its space. And when we do this, we're going to put it into perspective as well. Now, keeping this in mind, I am now going to zoom in as closely as I can and then drag this file into the corner. Now, as they always say, or I say, the first corner is free. You can get that to pretty much line up anywhere you want. I usually just take the bottom left just by a simple default. Nothing too critical. Kind of lining things up on a hyper level here. Okay. Then to do this stretch like this, if you hold down the Shift and Command key, and while you're continuously holding that key, if you drag any of the corner points, you'll be able to position them into the area that you want them to be. So right now I'm holding down Shift and Command within the Mac environment. There is a similar pairing of keys in the Windows environment. Apologies, I don't know them offhand. It's been a number of years, but it's something to the effect of Alt-Shift or Alt-Control. Okay, so now I'm just kind of zooming back and forth to kind of get my bearings. You can kind of see there's a ghost image appearing of the original artwork from episode 1 of the concrete background. It's funny because if you look at my layer stack, you don't actually see that image anymore, but it is part of the RAM ghost memory of this particular file. So it's kind of shows you how RAM doesn't really clear out just because you delete something. Okay, so again, still holding Shift Command, and I'm dragging my corner points into the positions that I want them to be. I can't actually see all of the grid because it goes off the canvas by quite a bit. So I'm just going to take a couple of random points here. I say random, but what I really mean is something that is more or less on the screen that I can visibly see the corners to. I need to make sure that as I'm dragging these points that I am going to select the same line that that creates this trapezoid or the shape of the perspective square. It gets a little tricky because as you can see there's an awful lot of crosshairs happening here, so I need to kind of keep in line where I want to go. I'm going to drag a guide here real quick, and it's asking me to apply a transformation. Get rid of that. Cancel. And still holding Shift Command, I'm going to drag this over to where I assume my line is at. I'm a little bit off, as you see on my lower left point here, my lower right point are not on the same line of perspective, but I'm going to get the ones into position that I know are correct. Now over here I'm going to adjust this a little bit using my far right point here. And then I'm bringing this down just ever so slightly. And I'm trying to be as hyper specific as I can because again, it's all going to become part of this. As I drag these center handles in and out, you can see that they are lining up with the other perspective points are part of the grid, which if it's doing that, then you know you're on the right path. Now clearly my top, my bottom, my left edges are for the most part correct. My far right edge is not. I need to get that back into alignment, so I'm going to now just drag this point over a little bit and try to play with it so that it is conforming to the grid that I've already built. Again, all through this process I am still holding those same two keys, the Shift and Command key. If I let go of them, it isn't the end of the world because I can still once again hit Shift and Command a second time to continue transforming the tool. But as long as I'm holding those two keys down, it allows me to continually play and transform this square. Now, I do not at any time want to hit the Enter key and commit this transformation until I am satisfied that it is in the area that I want it to be in and set to the right perspective. If I do confirm this transformation by hitting Enter, etc., then I will wind up with this trapezoid shape, which in and of itself is not a bad thing. Ultimately, we want to do that, but once you confirm the transformation and then you say, oh, this isn't really what I wanted to be, I want this to be a little different, and I go back into my transform perspective mode again, then I'm now putting a item that is in perspective and trying to put that item into additional perspective. It's not going to be as easy. You'll wind up with a very tricky time. You'll see what I mean if you ever make that mistake. You'll wind up with a bounding box that isn't what I'm working with right now. Okay, so I'm pretty satisfied. I'm going to drag these points around, kind of pull this one all the way down. Now we'll see, just if you're paying attention, that the item is going kind of far off the edge of my canvas. You can see it in this dead gray space. I'll talk about that more in a second here. Let's just kind of get this into position. The texture that I chose for this intentionally had a little bit of character and quality of texture to it, but not a whole lot of what you would consider granular bitmappy texture, because as you can see, as I drag this around, I'm pretty hyperextending this. I'm stretching this to pretty unrealistic expectations now, or unrealistic levels. You get this huge wing. There's almost more of it, 60% of the texture is hanging off the canvas than it was actually on the canvas. That's a problem for two reasons. First, because it's stretching unnaturally the texture quite a bit. We'll see if it's workable when this is done transforming. And the other reason is because all of that piece of the layer is still in memory, even if it's not being shown on the canvas. So we're going to have to take care of that, make sure that it's not using up more memory than we need. Alright, the perspective has been transformed. You can see that this is obviously blurred and dithered a little bit. Whether or not it's good or bad is ultimately up to you. I'd say this is over the edge of quality. I'd say it's probably not great, but for this exercise, we'll let it go. What you would do instead would be to create your own texture or to clean up these areas to make them more photorealistic. For now, this gets the general purpose of what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, so what I did was I copy and pasted. I did a command or an Apple A or Command A to select everything that was physically on the canvas, and then I hit Apple C and Apple V to copy and paste those items back down onto the canvas. By doing that, I now have just the piece that I needed, not all of the area that winged off to the right, because that is taking up memory that I don't need to be taken up. I'm now going to position some of this stuff back into place. Just kind of realign it so that it's in a nice workable area. Okay, zooming out here. Do a quick save. I'm at that point now in this build that we've committed enough time to it that it'd be foolish not to save it more often than not. Anyone who's worked with Photoshop or indeed any application knows that with enough time you're going to wind up losing your files if you don't save it more often or not. Okay, while that's saving, so while this is saving, jump back over here to iStock. I'm going to pull up some more concrete textures, and again reiterating that the stuff that I'm finding right now is for the most part not public domain. Just because you find stuff via Google or Bing, etc., doesn't mean that it's yours to use. Hopefully you already know that, but it's worth stating again. But I am just going to grab some things for this exercise, kind of get them in place. Now, as I'm going through my search and looking through these things on Google specifically, stuff that I really want to avoid, here's a good example of, for the most part, what I want to avoid. There's a lot of character to it. It's great, it's brilliant concrete, but it isn't usable. For the most part, it's because the texture is so robust that if I were to put this into perspective, it might have a problem with it. The green of the moss, for example, these pits and holes. This one, for example, with the pine needle isn't too bad. I can retouch that if I have to. Again, all of these are good selections of concrete, but bad in terms of trying to grab something to use in a retouching assignment. There's too much character in it. If you were to tile this and stretch it and repeat it, it wouldn't look right. Either the scale would be off or the repeating patterns would be obvious and easy to pick up on. I'm going to grab this one with the pine needles and just simply drag this right into the world of Photoshop. Obviously it creates its own layer like the last one did. Come on, there we go. And now I'm just going to reposition this. Before I do, I'm going to get rid of some of these characteristical flaws. These pine needles, for example. I'm using the traditional clone stamp tool. I'm just going to set this to a nice, soft, fairly large brush given the space. Select some space here that is fairly benign and just basically brush this out. I don't really care that it's super specific because it doesn't matter at this point. There's a pine needle up here I want to get rid of. You can see that Photoshop is starting to drag a little bit. That is to be expected, mostly because of the size of the file. Again, I'm at 30 by 30 inches at 300 dpi, which is pretty robust, all things considered. Not over the top. I've done images in 500 or 600 dpi before because it's easier to go down than it is to go back up, but still worth noting I need to save this more frequently. Okay, so again, the first corner is free. The second one is now the beginning of the transformation. Again, I'm holding down Shift Command. I'm just dragging the corner point. This works only with the corner points. If you drag the centers, it doesn't give you the same effect. Despite this particular facet being a little off, I'm going to still abide by it because the perspective is set. Kind of tricky seeing through this grid at this point, but I'm going to do the best I can. And it looks about right. I am confirming this transformation because that is kind of where I want it to be. And now there's a little bit of gap here between the two textures. So one of my pieces was a little off. It was the floor piece. I'm going to just kind of bring this up a little bit. I'm losing it on the left. That didn't work. I'm going to stretch this up. I think when I repositioned it last time it wasn't quite spot on, so there we go. When you're building something, it's always best to think of it in terms of ground up and from the background to the foreground. That's generally true for all illustrations and paintings, but it's certainly true here in retouching because we are physically building a world regardless of being two-dimensional. It is a three-dimensional build. Just like a photograph would be taking something in 3D space, so too must our images be laid out that way. Back to Google, finding some more canvas, or excuse me, some more concrete to work with. This one's a nice decent size. Let's see what we get. I have a feeling this is going to be we might get away with this one because I want to use this in some areas that are less real estate, less large, so I can probably get away with this one. That should be good. I may just use this one for some of my other textures. Just going to drag this back top of my layer, stack, make some copies of it, and kind of realign this. It's worth noting that if you have the move tool selected, the black arrow or the arrow tool at the very top of the tool stack, if you hold down the option key in the Mac world, whatever layer you've currently got selected by holding down the option key and simply dragging will make an automatic duplication of that layer for you. Of course, it duplicates everything that's on that layer, so it doesn't work if you don't have things pre-selected. Alright, once again, kind of zoomed in here. Now this is going to be tricky. I'm trying to put something together now for this larger floor panel here on the far left of my canvas. Missing a lot of the corner points. I'm just going to go by the grid that is easiest to access, which is just this section right here. You can see a little bit of a wing right here where it's warping. That's generally going to happen in Photoshop if your perspective is really extreme or unrealistic. Simply by going to a more traditional perspective, you'll usually get something that feels better and that warp goes away. But you will see anomalies happen like this if your perspective is not true to form. You can see I just drag this and I'm losing it. The upper right and the bottom right corners are not quite lined up correctly. You can see I'm way off over here. So I wasn't specific enough or wasn't precise enough with my selection. So we get this generally into place, and I'm going to zoom in. Go back up to this corner here, pull this over to where it should be. Come back down this way now, make sure this is lined up fairly well. It's not too bad, but still off, and off is not accurate. We want this to be as precise as we can. There we go. Lines up fairly good. Again, just for the record, holding down Shift and Command while I do this. If I let go of Shift and Command, again, it's not going to confirm anything. I can always hit those two buttons again, but this stretching and this reorienting of the corners only works. I'm holding down the Shift and Command tools, or buttons. Okay. Now I'm pulling this way out because even though I've satisfied the plane, the texture itself was too squashed, so I need to pull this open so that it feels more accurate in terms of a texture that actually fits that space, both for actual perspective and for truth and texture. I want to make sure it's not too squished. This too still feels a little too squished if you're asking my opinion, but we'll get by with that. Okay, so I'm using now the first of those two layer textures that I dropped in. I'm going to copy and paste this one on top itself just like I did before because I want to get rid of all that wing of the unused perspective Again, it's really more of a RAM saving technique than anything else. It will cause file corruption if that wing is too big. I've been there, so I know that that can happen. It's really more of a math problem in Photoshop's handling of files of excessive size. Alright, so I've made a duplicate copy of that layer. I'm going to continue using this particular piece of texture because these areas I'm in now don't really require their own unique layer. I could if I were being so bold, but I don't need to for this exercise. I think we're fine. So again, I'm just going to line this up based on the items I can see. Shift Command, grab this corner, pull it up to where it should be. Again, I'm just matching the grid that I've already built out. Pull this back down. There we go. Alright, so I'm just going to grab these two wings. I have let go of Shift and Command at this point. Whenever I pull these wings from the sides, I let go of Shift and Command. I'm simply doing a raw click. I'm not holding any keys down at this point. Holding the keys down now would make this further transform. I don't want to do that. Okay, once again, no buttons held down. I'm simply dragging that center point. And again, I'm doing this because I want to make sure that the texture is mostly true for its size, and the perspective is still true even if I did overshoot what I was looking for. Once this is done transforming, I'm going to take this layer and drive it behind the others. I'm just going to pull it down in my layer stack. Alright, so that's done. Let's bring this back down now underneath the second layer of floor so you can now see it looks and feels a little better. Alright, and I got basically two faces left. I've got that half wall here on the left and the thickness portion of that half wall. So I got two more textures I need to fill in. I've lost my grid because of course it's behind this panel, so I'm going to try to find it here in my stack. I've gotten lazy with my naming of my layers here, so I should probably take care of that sooner than later, but okay. Go. Just going to hide that back wall as I did. Now I can continue putting this back into perspective. Just going to drag this down again. Of course, I've got my Shift and Command keys held down for the corner points. Whenever I drag the half points or the middle handles that are not the corners, I let go of the Shift and Command buttons because that allows me to continue pulling things in perspective. But to actually establish that perspective is where, again, I hold down the Shift and Command key. So a lot of that, a lot of going back and forth. Okay, starting to lose my wall a little bit. A lot of overlapping grid work here. Okay, that looks pretty good. Not too bad. So we got basically just this one remaining piece. Let's see how specific I have to get with it. I'm just going to lock that top corner. Bring this one down. Okay, grab these last two corner points, see what I can do with it. Obviously that texture is really wigged out. Okay. I probably should be more concerned with this thickness plane like I did with the other two, where I'm going to pull it out and kind of make it feel a little bit more like the texture isn't being overly squashed. Let's just get this accurate first. Pull this guy back down. Okay. The top wing is a little off, that's alright. Okay, that's looking pretty rough, but again, that perspective is so minuscule. Alright, so what I'm going to do here is something a little different. I'm going to, now using the marquee tools, the selection tools, I'm going to make a selection of this wall, or this face of the wall, using that leading edge in the bottom corner, and then just making a negative selection, or I should say selecting the area outside of the wall itself. I'm just going to now simply hit the delete key. Oh, lost a little bit of a piece down here. Let's get rid of that guy. And you can see what's remaining now is the portion of my wall, the thickness portion of that face. Some things to note, of course, is that my textures are somewhat different. Not a huge problem, but it depends on how realistic you're trying to be. It is a problem on one level. But more specifically, the colors are far different. You got this, the plane the vehicle is sitting on has almost got like a blue-green cast to it. The back wall is pushing almost a magenta blue. And then the three unique walls, or the four faces on the left, are all definitely the yellow, red, orange category, which these are all different concretes. If these are meant to be the same pour or the same mix of concrete, they are definitely not from the looks of it. The colors are all weird, the textures are slightly different. These are things we're going to adjust closer to the end, or at least make them feel like they all belong to the same realm. For now, I'm only looking at texture, and I'm only looking at the perspective. We'll get to the colors later. So right now I'm looking also at the light. The light is coming from the upper right, coming almost from the right side down. The shadow indicates that for the most part. The light on the windshield indicates that. So I need to emulate that in all of my planes. Right now what I'm doing is I'm getting rid of the color information that's on each of these layers. The easiest way to do that is with each layer selected in the layers palette. If you hold down Shift Command and then type the U key, it will unsaturate, which is not a word, but it will desaturate all of the color information that is on that plane. It'll take it all the way to solid gray. Once I've done that and I've removed all the color information, automatically these things all start to relate better to each other. What's really pulling my eye now is that the contrast, the levels of brightness and darkness, are all very different for each of these. So with each of the layers selected, layer 5 currently, I simply hit the Command L key for levels, which you can also get to in the edit at the very top of the screen, I believe. And I'm just going to play with these now to feel more like light is influencing them the way I would expect, given where the light directionality is coming, which in this instance I've gathered is coming from the upper right-hand corner. So this step is going to be a little bit darker because it's going to be one of the areas that are mostly in shadow. And this plane down here on the lower level, if you will, that's going to be in shadow on some portion. And this half wall, of course, is also going to be in shadow. So for now, let's just kind of continue playing with my levels here. Alright, what do I want to do? So now I'm going to actually physically build the shadow. I'm going to do that first, considering that the light is going to cast a shadow from the step onto the lower level. So right now what I'm going to do is I've already pre-selected the layer itself, and now I'm just going to use the selection tool to deselect the portion that I don't want. There's really no right or wrong way, or there's many ways to do this, but basically I'm just creating a shape that I'm going to fill with black, and that shape is going to be the shadow. And of course I'm going to include in that shadow the step itself, that whole half wall on the far left, and the shadow that's being cast. All of those things will share the same unique shadow. I've created a separate layer, and I'm just going to fill that layer with the same black that I used for the shadow of the car, which is basically a rich black, the default rich black of Photoshop. Oh, looks like I missed right here. Let's drag that shadow up higher. There we go. It's all about stacking the layers correctly. So this is a very film noir black shadow. Definitely don't want it quite that dark. I'm going to set this layer to multiply, and then once I've done that, I'm going to adjust the opacity of that layer to something that I deem to be believable given the scene. Now, what that means to you personally is going to be all over the place. It's going to depend from image to image, and from how stylized you want to be to how realistic you want. I find that in retouching in general, subtlety is key. You don't really want to do anything in the extremes. You want everything to be somewhere in the middles, because when you do that, it feels better. It just feels more realistic. Alright, kind of getting to the final leg here, the last 5 minutes of this particular episode. So now that I've established generally my basic scene, textures in place, shadow in place, now I'm going to look for something to throw in the background. I probably really should have started here. I always tell my students to always start with the background, and I of course would mean sky then in this case first. This can be tricky. I generally think that most people get swayed by like really beautiful clouds and things like that. Just look at the texture of the concrete. Skies are very provocative, and everybody wants to use nice fluffy clouds, but I'm actually going to pull this one. I may as well have done this with a gradient, to be honest with you, but just to give you an example, I'm going to use this scene. It's a very cerulean blue, very common cloudless sky. I'm going to drag this in, just throw this right into the whole background of where the sky would be, and letting that go. I kind of want to use that lighter aquamarine tone down towards the bottom as part of my scene. And so here we go. Now this is still looking very foreign. We'll fix all this later. But right now I'm just trying to establish the scene, and whatever I do with this sky is ultimately going to determine the overall colors of my scene, car included. So I want to get my sky correct first. That's a big part of it. Now this is looking pretty blown out. Okay, so now that I've got my sky, the color at least, I do want to add some clouds to this. So I'm just going to look for clouds. And whatever I find is going to be a big chunk. Now clouds have their own perspective, they have their own angle and their own way of viewing them, so it's important that you don't just grab any cloud. It has to look like it's coming and going from the right angle. I'm already seeing one here. It's got a nice strong angle perspective to it. Now on the left here, I like this guy. Might be too strong, but we'll see how it works. This is obviously from Wallpaper Vortex, so it's again, subject to copyright, but we're just using this for educational purposes. Alright, now so obviously this already has a pre-built sky. There's already blue in here. So what does that mean for the blue that I've added in the back of my image? Well, for right now, I'm overwriting it, but I want the clouds, not the blue. So to do this, I'm going to set my layer to a different setting in a few moments. Let's see, I'm going to desaturate this like I did before with the Shift Command U technique, and then I'm going to hit Command L for levels. I want to blow this out really strong so that my darks are as close to black as I can get and my whites are as close as white as I can get, taking care to make sure that my midtones don't absorb too much of my faded areas. So with this cloud layer set in, I'm now going to set it to screen, which is the opposite of multiply. Screen means anything that's black will become transparent, and anything that's white will become opaque, the exact opposite of what multiply does. So with that, you can see what happened. Anything that was black went clear, and now the white areas, in other words the clouds, are now laying over top of my sky. The midtone areas kind of fall in between depending on how strong they lean one way or the other. I'll quickly relabel these layers because I'm getting lazy here. And I'm going to save this document. And that's pretty much it. So as this gets done, we'll kind of call this quits and then move on to the third chapter, which will be really more about putting in color information and final details, and that'll be great.